In this video, we're going to talk about the concept of training specificity. Now, as an average individual who is interested in health and goes to a fitness institute or a workout area, typically you're prescribed the type of training that bodybuilders might do, of course, on a lower level. So typically you might be told to do 3 sets of 10 repetitions of bicep curls or bench press or squats. And while you're doing that, you should bring the weight up slowly, perhaps 1 to 2 seconds, and hold it at the top, and then slowly bring it down 1 to 2 seconds. And that's fine. There's absolutely no problem with that. That will build strength for you and make your muscles healthy and provide you with an increased strength and force to allow you to do your activities of daily living. But as an athlete, you have to be aware of the training specificity concept. Now, what this means is that the way you train is the way you perform. So in terms of the angles at which you train, the type of muscle contractions that you use, and the speed at which you train will determine how well you perform, especially in athletic endeavors or in your work environment. So for example, we'll talk about angle specificity of training. If I want to do isometric contractions, so isometric contractions are contractions where the muscle does not change in length. So if I was to do this, that would be an isometric contraction of my elbow flexors or my biceps brachii. If I decided that I wanted to train like this for the next 6 to 10 weeks, and I want to do that kind of training at a 90-degree angle, what would happen is after 6 or 8 weeks, I would get very strong at this angle. There would be an increase in force, but if I was tested at a different angle, whether it be a longer angle or a shorter angle, there would be less and less transfer of strength to those other angles. So if I gained 100% strength at this angle, perhaps I'd only gain 20% at this angle or 20% at that angle. So the farther you deviate from the angle that you trained at, the less gains in strength you would get. So your training is very specific to the angle. So isometric training is used quite a bit in rehabilitation. And so if you're stuck in a cast and you're trained at one angle in order to decrease the amount of atrophy in a muscle, then when you get out, you'll be strong at that angle, but you won't be very strong at the other angles. So it's very important that if you're involved in a sport or an activity or in a work environment that you have to exert forces at extreme angles, that you work at those angles so you develop the strength at the angle that you need. Another type of specificity that we are worried about is contraction mode specificity. Now, contraction mode, 3 types of contractions. We just said isometric contractions, no change in muscle length. We have concentric muscle contractions. With concentric muscle contractions, the muscle is shortening. With an eccentric contraction, we have a lengthening of the muscle. Now, what typically happens when you go to the weight room and you see some guy on a lat machine? Now, a lat pull-down machine, he's pulling it down like this, and then the weight stack comes down and pulls it back up. So you normally see they'll pull it down as hard as they can, and then boom, they let it go and let it snap back up. Pull it back down, boom, snaps back up. What's your typical person do on the bench press? They're pushing it up as hard as they can, and then they let it drop and bounce on their chest, and then push it up again. So what they're doing is they're concentrating on these concentric contractions, shortening of the muscle, and then the eccentric portion, they're barely doing any work at all. If all you do is concentrate on the concentric contractions, then you become very strong at concentric contractions. You won't get as strong at eccentric contractions. So for example, I had a coach tell me one time after I gave a lecture similar to this, he says, I know exactly what you're talking about. He says, I have an athlete who's super strong, and when he's in a winning position, so in a winning position, he would be concentrically contracting to defeat his opponent. He does very well. But in a defensive position, when he's back and his arm's being pulled, and so the muscle is being lengthened, and he's working eccentrically, he loses very quickly because he didn't have a transfer of strength to the eccentric mode. So when you're doing your fitness training, it's important to do all 3 types of contractions. You want to do your concentric contraction, which of course everybody concentrates on. You want to do your eccentric contraction as well, so you get that eccentric strength. And then you probably want to, at the top or the end of the range of motion, do isometric contractions. So now you've got all three types of contractions covered in terms of your training specificity. And it's not important just for athletes, it's important for everyday walking activities. If you're an elderly individual, you're walking down the stairs. When you're walking down the stairs, you're doing eccentric contractions. So even elderly individuals have to worry about contraction mode specificity: concentric, eccentric, isometric. The third type of training specificity is velocity specificity. So again, as a bodybuilder, if you do bodybuilding type workouts, you're typically doing slow contractions. And that's good in terms of slow contractions ensure that you don't use momentum to toss the weight up and you don't have to use your muscles. But how many sports are performed in slow motion? Most sports are performed in a power mode or a speed mode. So you need to be able to contract as quickly as possible. Velocity specificity says that you get strong at the speed that you train at. So if you spend your time training with bodybuilding methods, slow bodybuilding methods, you'll become strong at slow contractions. But if you attempt to do contractions that deviate from that speed, there'll be less and less transfer of strength gains. A great example is back in the 1970s, Lou Ferrigno, who played the Hulk. Of course, we all know Lou Ferrigno was a huge bodybuilder, very, very strong. And so the Toronto Argonauts in 1978 signed Lou Ferrigno to a contract and said, we're going to make you a football player. First of all, you're big, you're strong, you're famous, and that should sell tickets for us. So they brought him to training camp. Lo and behold, they stuck him on the defensive line because he didn't have a lot of experience as a football player, and defensive linemen can be more reactive compared to offensive linemen. He was a terrible football player. You'd think, a terrible football player, he was 6'5" or 6'6". He was close to 300 pounds. How could somebody that strong not be a good defensive lineman? Couldn't he just knock people down? No, because bodybuilders contract slowly. He was very good at moving things slowly. In football, you don't move slow. You explode into your opponent. And smaller people with greater speed have greater power. And so even if he was going against a lineman that he outweighed by 40 or 50 pounds, if that lineman had more speed and be able to exert that speed with high forces, the power would knock Ferrigno over. And unfortunately, Lou didn't make the Toronto Argonauts, and Toronto didn't sell a lot of tickets. But it all had to do with the right kind of training. So when training, you must consider not only just being strong in general terms, but you have to consider what do you need that strength for. And whether it's a workplace, whether it's at home, or as an athlete, you have to consider the angles that you're going to be working at, the type of contractions you're going to be working with, and the speed that you're going to be working at. And all these three factors should be a consideration in the training program that you put together.